Good morning to American audiences. Good afternoon to European audiences, and good evening to our Bharat India audience. Uh, I am Ramesh Rao, professor at Columbus State University and also the editor of India Facts. And I come to you this morning wearing the hat of the editor of India Facts. It is our joy and pleasure and privilege this morning to introduce Suhag Shukla, our speaker for the day. And a very important topic that she is going to address about the perversity and illiberality of the people who have made Hindus and Hinduism a target. What I want to do today, and in my role, is first to introduce the speaker, and then I will hand it over to my fellow panelist, Avatans Kumar, to then give you instructions for how to, get to the Q&A and all of those kinds of important details. Okay. With that, I want to begin by saying that I'm really very happy that India Facts is hosting this talk, and India Facts, of course, is there because of the initiative, of the generosity, and of the farsightedness of Harikiran, who has a man of million initiatives. I don't know how many of you have heard of this other title, but I'm trying to play a little on that. But yes, Harikiran has initiated so many projects and has brought together so many people, and it is in that role, therefore, now as India Facts editor, that I am privileged this morning to host this talk and to speak about our distinguished speaker, Suhag Shukla. So Suhag and I have been fellow travelers now for at least 16 years, if not more. I was part of the Hindu American Foundation, worked on the Hindu human rights reports for 8 years. But Suhag, along with her husband Asim Shukla, and then Dr. Mihir Meghani and Nikhil Joshi, are the co-founders of the Hindu American Foundation. It is, to this day, after it was founded in 2003, the only such organization that seeks to represent Hindus across the world, and of course focused on the American part of it. Their office is in Washington, D.C., and they have done so much work that if I were to nominate anyone for next year's awards that the Indian government hands out, I should actually nominate Suhag for, it's not merely the longevity of work. It is the importance of work, but even more importantly, just the amount of energy and time and commitment and discipline that it takes to do the work that she does in the face of the constant, unremitting challenges posed against us by those illiberal and perverse people. Let me do this. I want to kind of very quickly read the highlights of Suhag's career. Let me open up my screen here. So she's the executive director and the co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. She has a BA and the Juris Doctor degrees from the University of Florida. So they have this strange kind of thing that they do. And Suhag, despite all these years, still committed to the Gators. Yeah. Over the past 2 decades, she has been recognized and has been the leading voice for civil rights, human rights, religious freedom issues. She has been instrumental in the development of a variety of educational materials, position papers that, from, published anywhere from the Washington Post to NPR and a variety of those kinds of platforms. She has served on the boards of the Nirvana Center, the Mainline Indian Association, and the Young Women's Christian Association of Minneapolis. She was also a member of the Department of the Homeland Security Faith-Based Security and Communications Subcommittee. She's actively involved with the Chinmaya Mission, serves on the board of the Bhutanese American Organization of Philadelphia, and is a thought partner for the Interfaith Center of Greater Philadelphia. Greater Philadelphia's Paths to Understanding Public Art Initiative. She's a member of the board of the National Museum of American Religion and serves on the religious advisory committees for the Council on Foreign Relations, the Humane Society of the United States, and the Department of Homeland Security's Subcommittee for the Prevention of Targeted Violence Against Faith-Based Communities. And importantly, because we are Americans and we believe in free speech, it is fundamental to the nature and being of the country that is our Karma Bhumi now. So she's a member of the First Amendment Center's Committee on Religious Liberty and the United Nations Women's Gender Equality and Religion Platform. So, oh, by the way, she was also named one of the 12 faith leaders to watch in 2017 by the Center of American Religious Progress. With that, what I would like to say once again is it is my privilege to invite her this morning. She has a very important set of information and points of agenda to share with all of you across the world. And with that, welcome, Suhag, and it is your platform for the next hour and 20 minutes.
Oh boy, no pressure there. Thank you. Alphonse, did you want to give some housekeeping?
Yes.
I forgot that.
That's okay.
No worries. Namaste, everyone. My name is Alphonse Kumar, and I'm going to be here with my co-panelists Ram Sundar and Nishant, working on collating some of your questions. And on questions, here is what we're going to do. Suhag is going to make her presentation in the first few minutes. And then based on that, we will have some QA after that, depending on how much time we have. And we will try to do our best in collecting your questions. So if you are on Zoom, put your questions in Q&A. There is a pop-up, there is a Q&A section. So you put your questions in there. And if you are on Facebook, you can put your questions there as well. And one of us will pick them up and present to Suhag, and she will answer them back. And we also have Arjun who is helping us. So Arjun is in Bharat. He's the assistant editor of India Facts. And the three of us here, Ram, Nishant, and myself are volunteering to help with this event. So Suhag, now it's up to you. It's on to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Rameshji, Ram Sundarji, Alphonse, and Nishantji, and Arjun, it's a great pleasure. Thank you to India Facts, as well as to Harikuran for hosting so many important conversations. We are going to be talking about a very relevant topic, and that is Hinduphobia. So I will first just share my screen, and I am presenting, when Rameshji reached out to me, first of all, I have to say that so much, not just so much, but our entire human rights portfolio rests on the shoulders of Rameshji. The efforts with which he got us on the ground in publishing the first ever documentation, comprehensive documentation of human rights atrocities against Hindu minorities was driven by one person whose dedication is unmatched. So I'm deeply grateful beyond just India Facts, but the service that you have provided not just to HAF, but most importantly to giving voice to millions of Hindus around the world who are persecuted simply because of the traditions that they've been born into or the identity that they choose. And so for that, we're forever grateful. With that, I will share my screen and hopefully not mess anything up. All right. Do you see the presentation? Yes, and you don't see my notes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Full disclosure, I have notes because I have a tendency to go on tangents. So this way we can keep the conversation tight. So the first thing I'm going to start with, hold on just one second. We need to get to, we can forward this slide. Okay, did that slide advance? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So, as I mentioned, the topic today that we're talking about is Hinduphobia. And a couple of months ago at Rutgers University, there was a conference on understanding Hinduphobia. And the participants, many of whom the names are probably familiar, academics like Jeffrey Long, Arvind Sharma, Indu Vishwanathan, they all were participating in this, and they came up with a working definition of Hinduphobia. Now, while HAF didn't participate in the conference, we've adopted the working definition. And here's why. I think it's important to have some consistency in nomenclature for three reasons. When we talk about Hinduphobia, I know anytime we post about Hinduphobia on Instagram or Facebook or anything, someone's like, why aren't you using Hindu odium? Why aren't you using Hinduism? Why aren't you using Hindu dvesha? I don't think any of these words I think these words cover the phenomenon that we're trying to talk about and we're trying to cast light on and to eliminate. But at the same time, Hinduphobia, yes, it's also imperfect. Is everyone scared? Because that's what a phobia is, right? Is everyone scared of Hinduism? Is that what the motivation is behind a lot of the Hinduphobia that we see? Not necessarily, but just like the word Hindu, it's a word that probably is most widely recognized and understood. And for that reason, I've had a love-hate relationship with the word, but I'm slowly coming around to adopting it. And there are places where anti-Hindu hatred is more appropriate, maybe Hindu odium is, but today I'm just going to kind of talk about Hinduphobia. The reason I think it's important, in addition to the reason why I think it's important to have some consistency and alignment in terminology is one, it becomes a starting point. It becomes a starting point for us to develop methodologies for recognizing it when it's occurring or has occurred in the past. What do methodologies do? They enable us to call it out consistently and credibly, which in turn empowers us to push back against people who are denying the existence or occurrences of Hinduphobia. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more. And it's also been a word that's been around for quite some time. I think just yesterday, as I was thinking through what I would talk about today, I found references to the word Hinduphobia as far back as 1800s. So it's not as new as a lot of people might think. So what is this working definition? I'm just going to read it out loud and then I'm going to break it down a little bit more. Hinduphobia is a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors towards Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism and Hindus that may manifest as prejudice, fear, or hatred. Hinduphobic rhetoric reduces the entirety of Sanatan Dharma to a rigid, oppressive, and regressive tradition. Pro-social and reflexive aspects of Hindu traditions are ignored or attributed to outside non-Hindu influences. This discourse actively erases and denies the persecution of Hindus while disproportionately painting Hindus as violent. These stereotypes are used to justify the dissolution, the external reformation, and demonization of the range of indigenous Indic knowledge traditions known as the Sanatan Dharma. So you can visit this. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it gives you an idea of kind of the comprehensive manner in which this definition is trying to address the phenomenon of Hinduphobia. So, next slide. So recognizing Hinduphobia. So as I've been mulling over the working definition, I can't escape the way in which I approach most subjects, probably approach my family life as well, much to the chagrin of my family, and that is as a lawyer. I tend to want to break things down and see how can we translate conceptual frameworks or a working definition here to a model or a methodology that would allow me as an advocate or the average Hindu or non-Hindus, because it's important that non-Hindus also recognize Hinduphobia, to understand and recognize Hinduphobia when it occurs and to advocate against it or fight against it. So from a legal perspective, let's take the concept of crimes or torts. Every crime or tort has a set of elements. Those are like 3 bullet points or 5 bullet points, whatever the case may be, depending on what the crime is, of points that you have to meet in order for you to be able to establish a case. So looking at this definition, I've taken a stab at identifying elements, supporting evidence, and supporting evidence to establish the elements. So this is really this is the first time I'm even talking about this framework because it literally came to me maybe yesterday or the day before. So bear with me, it's a work in progress, and I look forward to getting all of your input as well. So the 2 things from that definition that immediately stuck out to me were intent and impact. These are the 2 primary elements in my line of thinking in helping distinguish between things that are Hinduphobia and other things that are, say, ignorance or error. So when we talk about Hinduphobia as a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors, to me, that's striking at the heart of intent. Antagonistic, what does that mean? It's an aversion or a dislike of Hindus and Hinduism. Destructive. What's a destructive attitude? It's one that does not want Hindus or Hinduism to exist or to exert power. Derogatory is an attitude or behavior that doesn't respect Hindus or Hinduism. So the second piece of this is impact, right? When we're talking about reducing the entirety of Sanatan Dharma to something that's rigid and oppressive and regressive, when we're taking things like yoga or Ayurveda and stripping them of their spiritual roots, or namaste in yoga, as our great state of Alabama did just a few weeks ago, or actively erases the persecution of Hindus. I mean, why did HAF, when we started, even think about publishing a human rights report? Because the mainstream organizations like Amnesty International were dedicating all but maybe like 5 lines to atrocities that have been consistently faced by Hindu minorities in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Malaysia, in Bangladesh, and around the world. So that is an active erasure and a denial of not just active persecution, but as we see in academia, historical persecution as well. In line with this, we also see kind of that active painting of Hindus as uniquely violent. So what is those are all impacts. So to me, as I'm looking at kind of broad categories of what are we talking about here, we're talking about an impact that delegitimizes our voice, that demonizes our tradition, that otherizes Hindus, whether it's in the public square, whether it's in civic spaces, whether it's in academic spaces, whether it's in the media. It reduces the tradition to sometimes being not even recognizable. It erases persecution. It ends up actually lending to persecution it desecrates and it destroys. Now, of course, these impacts are not by any means comprehensive, but it's just a way to kind of break down this concept or this working definition of Hinduphobia. So, impact is generally measurable, right? Because we can see persecution, we can see suffering, we can read texts or academic work or media coverage that doesn't reflect the ground realities that we know to be true. But intent is something that's a little bit more difficult. Intent is, as a definition, it's ordinarily not perceivable, right? You have to infer it from surrounding contexts, including motive. So one thing we can look at in determining intent, if we're going to look at any particular instance to determine whether it's Hinduphobia, is what's the underlying intent? And I'm sorry, what is the underlying motive that might be driving the intent to actually act out of this motive? So as I was looking, and again, these are not comprehensive by any means. This is still a very, very newborn conceptual framework. But what these concepts that I thought about in the big picture are religious exclusivism and supremacy, religious supremacy, racism, colonialism, Marxism, and modernity. And so I'll talk about these 5 motives. And after I go over just 1 or 2 more things in terms of the conceptual framework or methodology, I'm going to dig into specific instances and then leave the rest for our conversation. So these 5 are independent and overlapping themes, as we'll see in my later examples. And they end up becoming the underlying motives of Hinduphobic thought, words, and action. The other thing that's important is that these motives, how do they take shape? And the way that I'm thinking about it is through 2 large phenomenon or forces. So historically, conquests and colonialism, motivated at least partly by notions of religious supremacy, religious exclusivism, and racism, have been the external forces that have engaged in Hinduphobia, whether it's through academic study of India, whether it's through policy making, whether it's through looting or forceful conversions, or whatever the case may be. These are kind of the motives that have come from external forces. Subsequent to, I guess, the first meeting between these kind of very diametrically opposed civilizational ethoses, right? Because I don't know if that's ethoses or ethos. Grammar police, you can correct me on what the plural is there. But the Indic traditions are not exclusivist. They are inherently pluralistic, and they come to heads with this very different type of ethos that insists on one truth path, insists that once you pick that path, it's that path and no other path, right? That external phenomenon or motive then becomes empowered through power asymmetries, right? Through colonialism and through conquests, and allows for the perpetration and perpetuation of Hinduphobia in what is kind of vertical hostility or a top down. That's historical, but the history is on a continuum. It hasn't gone away. So today, we still have these external forces, but we also have internal forces that are motivated by a variety of factors, including continued colonial hegemony and basically a colonial hangover, especially because the British essentially destroyed most indigenous forms of education and replaced it with British education. You also have sloppy and uncritical force fitting of Marxist oppressed oppressor framework onto Hindus as the majority in India. Now, this Marxist framework becomes especially harmful and leads to a cognitive dissonance in the American or actually any diasporic context for Hindus because we're a minority outside of India. And then there's notions of modernity, where modern is equated with Western and retrograde is tied in with the Hindu traditions. And there's a great deal of work that S.N. Balagangadhara and Prakasha and others have done, as well as Vishwa Adluri, Joydeep Bagchi, and a number of other scholars who are digging into kind of the roots of things that today, when we talk about modernity or science, we just assume them to be objective, but they aren't necessarily. There are, religious underpinnings to that, and a lot of it is through only a European lens. So given the legacy of colonialism and continued Western hegemony, when it comes to academia, media, and policy, externally perpetrated and perpetuated Hinduphobia still tends to be vertical, meaning it's resulting from a power and access asymmetry. And Hinduphobia perpetrated by other Hindus is an example of horizontal hostility, which is a sociological phenomenon used to describe factionalism within a minority movement. So I'll now go to some specific, well, actually, before I get to specific examples. So I've presented kind of a broad methodology, so to speak, to identify Hinduphobia. In some sense, it's still theoretical. You identify the impact, and then you look to surrounding circumstances like motive, context, or other factors to discern intent. Easy, right? Not always. So many times, the way Hinduphobia manifests is complex and subtle. It requires subject matter familiarity or expertise or working knowledge of history. But other times we know it when we see it. But the problem is other non-Hindus may not, or we may lack the vocabulary to articulate why something is Hinduphobic. So that's where HAF's Hinduphobia and Anti-Hindu Hate glossary enter. This is something that, I guess, a platform or a resource that we created just recently, probably about a month or a month and a half ago. I will be, full disclosure, it's been inspired by similar glossaries from the Jewish community that highlight how anti-Semitism can be recognized and how it takes shape in the media or in policy. So in this glossary, we've put together a spectrum of terms and tropes, which have lent to the demonizing of Hindus, the persecution of Hindus, and the overall portrayal of Hindus as grotesque, untrustworthy, bigoted, evil, or violent. And while hate speech is still free speech, and thank you, Rameshji, for bringing up free speech, because so many times when something happens in the media, people are like, you should sue them, or, this is hurting my sentiments. In the Western framework, and actually, if you go back to even our civilizational ethos, we don't have this notion of blasphemy, which is what hurting religious sentiments is. That said, I firmly believe that the solution to hate speech, which is free speech, unless it translates to action, is more speech. That's where we have a role in educating others about how certain terms and tropes have been used, not just historically, but in present time to harm Hindus, and how, if and when they're used regularly over time, the perception of Hindus as grotesque or untrustworthy, violent, whatever it is, are just going to grow and generate greater and greater levels of danger for Hindu lives and well-being. So what are some of these words? And I invite you to visit www.hinduamerican.org. And if you go under projects, you will find a link to Hinduphobia and the glossary. But maybe if there's an email that goes out to all the participants afterwards, I can share that link. So what we've done is we've identified, I don't know, I lost count. Maybe it's 20 words, maybe, don't quote me on that. There might be more, there might be less. And we've also included an open invitation for anyone who's visiting the website that if we have overlooked a word or if a particular term begins taking on Hinduphobic flavor, we'll add it to this glossary. So what the glossary does, the format is we provide a word, we provide a definition, and we provide an explanation of why it's Hinduphobic, and where there's an example, like from Twitter or from the media, we will have an image of that. So that really gives not just Hindus who want to speak out against Hinduphobia or who want to learn more about it, but also our allies, non-Hindus who don't stand for the demonizing of other people on the basis of their identity, their religious identity or faith identity, that they too can be empowered to speak out. So I'll just give you an example of one of the words that really generated a lot of emotions, I'll just say, and actually a lot of Hinduphobia. Ironically, when we did our social media campaign to generate awareness and let people know about this resource, we unleashed a floodgate of Hinduphobia, therein proving our point. So that's always a nice thing, but not a nice thing. So the definition of a word like brahmanism. So what our glossary says is that brahmanism is a term created by 19th and early 20th century European Indologists to describe and define Hinduism as a religion made up by the Brahmin priestly class. While it lost currency among many religion scholars by the mid-1980s and viewed as a form of neo-colonialism, some continue to use the term and its derivatives. We also include derivatives of the term. Then going to why it's Hinduphobic. And I'm not going to read all of it, but just to give you a taste of it. Why it's Hinduphobic, an invented word that is not seen in Hindu texts and not used by Hindus to define, describe, or understand their traditions. Brahmanism as a term and concept has its roots in white and Christian supremacy, as well as anti-Semitism. And then it goes on and gives just a very surface level 101 on how Protestant bias and Christian animosity towards Jews, and then popular racist theories of the time, all lent to this idea of a domineering, light-skinned priestly class that was subjugating the indigenous. So I invite all of you to use this glossary, to send in your suggestions if we've missed something. So now I will just quickly go over a couple of specific examples in academia, in media, and in policy. And the reason I think you could flip academia and media either way, but the reason that I started with those two is that they are the most influential. Academia influences media, media influences academia, but both of those influence policy. I mean, in some way, they're all interconnected, but it just made sense to start with academia. So some may argue that the very foundation of Western Indology is Hinduphobic. From our cosmology to caste, most of what the West regurgitates about us and our way of life is more a reflection of their experience or their view of us rather than our view of us. So while malintent may no longer be front of mind for some, the refusal to acknowledge the colonial constructs and the religious color of those constructs, and the insistence that these constructs are objective and scientific, as opposed to emic voices then being portrayed as unscientific, not emotional, not objective. This is what we might call in the legal world reckless disregard. It's a conscious effort to avoid learning or recognizing inherent biases. So the example I can give just at a high level is sympathy for a cause here, say for the sacred lands of Native Americans, as this is the geography of Indigenous people. But that same sympathy for a cause or support for a cause will not be lent to Hindus as the indigenous people of the subcontinent. Decoloniality, when it's applied to African and Latin civilizations, is seen as a welcome trend in academia, but there's a refusal to do that for Indic civilizations. So we see Hinduphobia then in scholarship. And then also when we talk about vertical hostility as well as horizontal hostility, both of those really come to heads here because we have a lot of scholar activists that are steeped usually in Marxist or Marxist influenced scholarship and what scholars like S.N. Bala Gangadhara call colonial consciousness. So there we go. So this is, I'm not going to go too into, I keep saying that and then I go in depth. Sorry about that. This is why I have notes. So heritage learner. This is one of the terms in our anti-Hindu hate glossary or Hinduphobia glossary. The reason I want to bring it up is because it's so important. I am the parent of two students, one who's a recent graduate from college and one who's a sophomore. And when I learned about this from a friend of mine who's a professor in the humanities at an Ivy League school, I literally, my jaw dropped. So generally, heritage learner is a technical term for a language student who already has certain linguistic skills when they enter a classroom to learn other aspects of language, such as script or grammar. But when it comes to Hindu students on campus, some South Asian professors have begun referring derogatorily to Hindu students of Indian origin as heritage students, a derivative of heritage learner. So what's a heritage student? In the context of South Asian studies, it's a derogatory term used to refer to our children. These students, when they're enrolled in courses that are related to Hinduism, that are related to Indian history, to Sanskrit, etc., are viewed as having been conditioned or brainwashed with generally positive views on their religion and culture. Some South Asian professors, especially those engaged in scholar activism, view the presence of these students as imposing an additional burden on them to re-educate them, to deprogram them. These are the kinds of words that are oftentimes used in the coffee room on college campuses, and then replacing the students' understanding with colonial and Orientalist narratives, or narratives which rely on selective translations or conjecture to fit a particular political ideology, and in this case, Marxist ideology. Now I'll shift over to media. So here is a classic example of one of the glossary terms, cow piss drinker. You know, had we had the glossary at the time, I think it would have been a lot easier. And in some sense, these types of interactions were the inspiration, in addition to seeing how the Jewish community is advocating for itself and empowering its community as well as its allies. So we gave NPR, we've had an ongoing relationship with a number of media houses in the hopes of trying to give them better context, to push them towards more nuanced understandings of Indians and Hindus and Hinduism. It's still a huge work in progress, as we all know. But we reached out to NPR. We gave them a little 101 on the history of the trope cow piss drinker and how this particular terminology has historically been used to denigrate and subjugate and commit violence, in fact, against Hindus. Just 8 months prior, and this was something that a reporter on the ground from India DM'd me about, so it was a nice partnership there in really holding NPR accountable, mentioned that just 8 months prior to this tweet by Furqan Khan, the suicide bomber who killed 40 plus Indian security personnel in the Pulwama district in Kashmir, said, quote, "Listen to me, you Indians, we're going to unleash such terror on people like you who drink the urine of cows, won't be able to contain." So you can see how, yes, hate speech is free speech, but if it's just used without people calling it out, it can eventually manifest as actual violence. And that's why it's important for us to draw awareness around it. Another example in Hinduphobia in the media is the coverage of Kashmir. So we did an analysis of 130, I think it was 130 articles from Washington Post, from New York Times, NPR, CNN, and BBC. 130 articles analyzed, 0 mentioned Kashmiri Pandits. 0 mentioned the fact that 350,000 indigenous Kashmiri Hindus were cleansed from the valley as a result of an insurgency and cross-border proxy war by Pakistan in 1989. Now, it's not like, fine, you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it's not written about in the human rights documentation or whatever. But the fact is that if you actually go back into the archives of these papers, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, I don't think New York Times, from what I remember, all of them covered this as an active story in '89, but then they ignored it in whatever 2019. So surely these writers had access to Google or to their archives, but here is another demonstration of erasure and the intent being, we could put it into kind of that colonial hangover when it's Indian journalists and other things. How are we on time? I have just a few more slides. Are we good? Thumbs up? Yes? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
yeah, good.
All right. So in the policy space, I'll reserve talking about specific policies in our conversation if it comes up. But I want to talk about something that just happened in the last year that has started targeting not just politicians, but ordinary Hindu Americans. So it really begins to hit home. So when Tulsi Gabbard announced her run for president, it was supposed to be a historic moment. It was supposed to be a moment where we at HAF thought, oh, hey, there's probably going to be a lot of curiosity about what Hinduism is. This is a good opportunity for us to be able to educate the public on how Hinduism positively influences 1 billion people around the world. Unfortunately, that opportunity did not come. So in much of the early reporting on Gabbard's run, a misconceived and dangerous thread quickly rose to the surface, and that was one of dual loyalty. Dual loyalty that any politically engaged Hindu American must be dually loyal to India and a Hindu nationalist, a Hindu supremacist, a Hindu bigot, fill in the blank, a Hindutvavadi. So while none of the reports defined what it actually meant to be a Hindutvavadi or a Hindu nationalist or a Hindu supremacist, it was very clear from the context that it was a pejorative. It was like, ooh, watch out, here come those Hindus. They're taking over, they're dually loyal. Let's not forget that accusations of dual loyalty in the past in this country have led to the internment of Japanese Americans throughout Europe. It led to the Holocaust with European Jews. So dual loyalty is not just something that we can be flippant about. It has real world implications. So what happens is that there's no consideration as to where an individual may objectively fall on the American political spectrum and what specific policies they support, let alone their interest or understanding in Indian politics. I'll be the first to admit, I've had to learn more about Indian politics because of my role at HAF than I ever personally had interest in. Of course, at HAF, we have folks who are interested in close observers, but because of this constant otherizing or placing us in a position of having to answer for foreign governments, namely the Indian government, is a part of this whole notion of dual loyalty. So the first piece that was published by The Intercept, and then it was later edited. So you can see what I've highlighted here. According to an expert consulted by The Intercept, that are of names that are of Hindu origin. Can you imagine if there was an article and some paper says, we hired an expert to identify all the Muslim sounding names or all the Jewish sounding names? What sort of reaction would we have gotten? Instead, when we have this, silence. Luckily, thanks to not any of the, kicking and screaming that was occurring from the community, but from a white American journalist who called The Intercept out. The editors eventually took that line out and then said something like, it was not the intention of The Intercept to, quote, question the motives of those political donors. So this is just kind of an idea of what came out of, like, kind of the first very high profile Hindu American in the public square. This, unfortunately, was not in isolation. It snowballed into a series of incendiary stories about Hindus and otherizing them. Mother Jones, Vox, all carelessly and without verification, republished the original trope of Indian and Hindu American donors. First to Tulsi, but then eventually to Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, to Sri Kulkarni, who was running for Congress in Texas, to Padma Kupa, who's a former board member of HAF and now serves in the State House in Michigan. All of our donations, including mine, were, cast as something that was being driven by some nefarious agenda, as opposed to us maybe promoting free speech, separation of church and state, and religious liberty and civil liberties here in America. So that gives you some taste into to how Hinduphobia can manifest in the policy space, specifically in terms of the attacks on individuals. And we can talk about specific policies later. So best practices. I want to end on a note that doesn't make us all feel hopeless, at least in my presentation. So the first thing is we have to avoid crying wolf. There's my friendly wolf picture. A denial of Hinduphobia, of even existing, is already rampant. So calling something Hinduphobic when it may be ignorance or error undermines our ability to protect ourselves in the face of genuine Hinduphobia. So some of the reactions that I tend to see, and maybe other people have coined this as well, but I see it almost as like the Abrahamization of the Hindu response. We are, speaking in terms of blasphemy or apostasy, when really those types of values are not inherent to our tradition. So that's where kind of the framework that I presented, I thought maybe might be helpful to people to be able to make those distinctions and to be more nuanced in our advocacy for ourselves. So a couple of other best practices: study our tradition and our history. Find those sources that are, and there's, I mean, in the last 5 to 10 years, just an explosion of stories of historical stories and other explanations of the tradition that are really carving out emic understanding of our tradition and digging into the volumes and volumes of untranslated texts that are giving us a peek into how life was in the subcontinent 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Then study the history of Hinduphobia. We have a short legal history of Hinduphobia in America on our website. It's also in the same section that glossary is in. There's interesting Instagram handles. I follow at Hindu History, which has a lot of information about historical Hinduphobia. I know India Facts just published an article by Ram Sundarji on the history of Hinduphobia. So there's a lot of resources that we can read to better understand the historical context to be able to then recognize it in the present moment. I have my 3V philosophy. I credit the ancients and the rishis for this, but vichar, vivek, vairagya. Be thoughtful, be discerning, and be objective in your information consumption and your analysis of it. And most importantly, your response, not your reaction, but your response to it. So if you find the methodology that I've suggested at looking at surrounding circumstances to make your best educated estimation about whether something is Hinduphobic, remember, intent is informed by motive and context. So look for the impact, Does it demonize? Does it delegitimize? Does it erase, etc.? And then once you've found something that's Hinduphobic, do something constructive. Write a letter to the editor. If you don't know how to word it, use the glossary. You can quote it. Support efforts of those who are working on Hinduphobia as it's being addressed or advocated against in the academy or in the policy space. And lastly, encourage your children to enter fields like journalism, the humanities, and policy, provided that you've done step number one, which was learn your history. Don't send them in ill-equipped, because as I told you about heritage learners or heritage students, there are voices and forces that are there to actively perpetuate the Hinduphobia that we've been dealing with for hundreds of years. So with that, I will stop my screen share and we can have our conversation.
Yes, thank you so much, Suhag, for that wonderful summary. I will let Avtans and other panelists take over and direct questions, for you. But I think it's very important, as you mentioned, in terms of our own young, going to college and becoming interested in the social sciences and humanities. It is a double-edged sword. We are seeing so many of our own young deracinated and being sold a bill of goods about us that they then become carriers of. And I think that, as we saw recently in the Slate article, in spite of reaching out to this young man who is a fellow Spartan, back channel and say, hey, look, this is it, completely not only ignoring myself, and he did not have the courage to call me and say, hey, you know what, Ramesh Rao, let's talk, give me some information. He never bothered to even respond. Yeah. These are the young men and women who are getting into these areas, and how do we kind of literally, it's kind of that kind of toxic education that they have become part of. And I think this is where this conversation has to go further and see how that kind of education really, because we need to be engaged. We need to be engaged at home. We need to be engaged in our community so that when they go to, college, so when they get their degrees in these areas, that they may not become, advocates as much as real, true, objective scholars and reporters and opinion writers.
Right.
Okay.
No, that's
with
exactly,
that. Yeah.
I'll just quickly add on to that is that, this is part of a larger trend. So it's also an opportunity. In addition, I think that I am an optimist. I believe that there's a silent majority who recognize these trends that our young people are also getting swept into, of just simplistically seeing the world as oppressed and oppressor, and just through that framework, and in some ways in the South Asian space, and I use South Asian specifically there for a reason because that is the identifier there. We're the oppressor in spite of being a minority. And so that's where I talked about that cognitive dissonance, that when you take that Marxist framework outside of India, where even in India, you've got to look also regionally. Hindus are not a majority in Kashmir.
Yeah.
So anyways, questions.
All right. We have several questions, so I'll take some of them from here Q&A, and then Ramesh, Nishant Bhai and Ram Bhai will take some of those questions from other forums. So one of the first questions that I have here from Q&A is from Kamal Said. It's basically about the persecution of Hindus outside of India and their human rights. So because he talks about Rohingyas and other things. So would you like to talk about a little bit about the human rights of Hindus outside, how they are persecuted?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have, going back to my very flattering bio. Thank you, Rameshji. Unfortunately, we have to post those things, but I have the most amazing team of fellow staffers at HAF, a visionary board, a national team that have full-time jobs, and on top of that, still dedicate anywhere from 20 or more hours a week to help with the work of HAF, and of course our supporters who buy into a vision of professionalized advocacy. So there are people who are far better versed on human rights, including Rameshji, but where you have, I can talk about Pakistan, where you have social and systemic discrimination against the Hindu minority. A specific toll is faced by women and girls as a result of forced conversions and then being sold off into sex slavery or being married off to men who are strangers and twice their age. These things are happening in the Sindh province in the thousands per year. And only now are we seeing American policymakers acknowledging these things. If we look at Pakistan's education system, the United States was pouring millions of aid dollars into improving textbooks there in order to remove the teaching of hate against Hindus, against Jews, against India, against Israel, and really trying to support education that would raise a new generation of people who saw the world in less hateful terms. And it wasn't until we got at least some agencies translated text to say, hey, listen, all those millions of dollars that you're sending in aren't really changing the books. I don't know where they're going. So as an American, as an American organization, we talk to our policymakers to ensure that human rights and religious freedom are at the top of their list, in addition to economic stability or security or whatever the other things that they're talking about in terms of nation to nation and people to people connection. As far as the Indian government, we have commended different Indian governments. We have criticized different Indian governments, regardless of who's in power. And since the time that Rameshji first started writing our human rights report, one of the recommendations that we had was to provide some sort of pathway to amnesty or legal refugee status. Because we've been doing work with Pakistani Hindu refugees in Jodhpur for now close to 15 years. We have established or support a medical clinic and a number of other things to serve the needs. And the problem is at least prior to the Citizenship Amendment Act, there wasn't really a legal pathway. So there were kind of stopgap measures, but that made it impossible to resettle, to get gainful employment, to continue education, all of these things. So they were kind of in this legal limbo, having fled persecution and then kind of facing a different sort of persecution. So we make recommendations to the Indian government, and we've done that, under the Congress Party, under the BJP, and it's a work in progress. We'll work with any government, as we'll work with any party here in the United States, Republicans and Democrats, whoever's willing to listen and to do something to find solutions so that people who are facing human rights atrocities can get some sort of relief so that they can live with dignity and mutual respect.
Ram, you have a question, or Nishant?
No questions on Facebook right now, but you can continue.
I can go. Yeah, I can go. We have compiled a list of questions. I can ask one.
Okay.
There are no other advocacy organizations for Hindus working in the nation's capital other than HAF. What has been your experience working with other organizations? how have they received advocacy by Hindus?
Great question. We have, I mean, there are other efforts that are advocating for the community, and they are, there's grassroots efforts, and they're largely volunteer-based. I believe we are at least the largest staffed Hindu advocacy organization. We have 13. We're hiring. If anyone wants to work for HAF, we have 3 positions. Mihir Meghani would get very upset at me if I didn't plug that. But the reception amongst civil rights organizations, against faith-based organizations, has been overwhelmingly positive. We have worked with organizations, and the organizations actually kind of run the American political spectrum. So, for instance, we work on something called the International Religious Freedom Roundtable. You have evangelicals there, and you have Hindus there. In terms of theological differences, you know, religious exclusivism, religious pluralism, you kind of have bookends there. But where we can find points to work together, we do. Where we disagree, we just say thanks, but no thanks. So that's one example. We are active with the American Civil Liberties Union. We've worked with the Anti-Defamation League on issues like marriage equality. We've worked with Americans United for the Separation of Church and State to promote clearer boundaries between church and state. So whether it's legislative prayer or a prayer on a football field by a coach, and the impact that that might have on students of no faith or minority faiths, all those things are issues that we've worked on with a number of prominent and mainstream organizations. Our reception with government agencies has been overwhelmingly positive, and now they look to us as a credible resource. We have worked with the US State Department, we work with the Department of Justice, with the FBI, I mean, you name it. And of course, Congress across the aisle. I will say that the most difficult meetings that I have had, and Rameshji has been on some of these meetings with me, are from fellow Desis. When we talk about horizontal hostility, you know, I honestly, we have a fly-in day every year where we, of course, we didn't do that last year because of COVID, but a huge delegation of Hindu Americans fly in. We break up into teams. This is something that many communities and many special interest groups do. We break up into small groups and we disperse on Capitol Hill. And we cover sometimes 50, 60 offices where we're talking about certain legislative priorities. It might be immigration, it might be human rights, whatever is on the docket for that particular year. And some of the most difficult and caustic meetings are not with your average Asian or white Caucasian staffer. It's with a fellow Desi staffer. And you know, on the one hand, it's great that people in our community are entering into these fields, and we're rising in prominence to becoming political appointees, judges, this and that. But going back to needing to know our history, needing to know the tradition, there's sometimes a missing piece, and so we are treated almost with more of a suspicious eye than others, and there's a lot of conflation going on between what we're trying to advocate as Americans and some sort of like back channel evil Hindu supremacist agenda. So it's been an interesting journey. Rameshji and I had one meeting one time where instead of meeting us in the office, this young Indian staffer took us to the cafeteria and then began questioning us about our affiliation with the RSS and VHP and BJP and everything in the middle of the cafeteria. And you know, our delegation knew that we had the truth and the facts on our side, that we are an independent organization and we were there to advocate for issues that are impacting Hindu Americans. in his efforts to try to get us to trip up and then revealed our secret agenda, which there was none, so we're not going to trip up. I think at the end he ended up storming out. Maybe Rameshji, maybe you did too. I can't remember. But
Well,
these are
I
the
mean,
kinds of experiences we have.
yeah, we will not mention names, but I think the other meeting that we had, if you remember, where we went to the RFK Foundation, and the person who met with us, a former Time correspondent, Time magazine correspondent, and how disdainful her attitude was. And
Yeah.
fellow Desi.
Yeah.
And that, I think, the kind of deracination that has occurred, or the kind of politics that is seen as good, and that we represent somehow a devilish Hindu group, is what for me is the most challenging aspect in this dynamic, modern dynamic that we are part of.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's not much patience or even priority given to due diligence. Hey, let me do my homework. Let me actually go to their website and see what is their stance on marriage equality, what is their stance on free speech, or gun safety reform, or whatever the case may be. Ironically, folks on the American right who are within our community think we're soft, and the and those on the far left think we're too hard, which to me then demonstrates that as a nonpartisan organization who really tries to approach issues through a dharmic lens, we're doing our job right. And I do, as I said earlier, I'm an optimist, and I think that people are tiring of this, especially that silent majority of just casting the entire world in black and white terms and binaries. So our approach is just keep doing what we're doing, stick to the principles that we believe in, real secularism, not pseudo secularism, real freedom, real pluralism, and ultimately the truth will prevail.
I have a question here, which is just, you were talking about bipartisan and partisan, and so that kind of question again, and the same question, but two questioners have asked, but two different perspectives. One is Rukmini and one is Manu from Singapore. So basically, it's a question about Hindutva, Hindu nationalism. So how do you deal with BJP and Hindutva, right? And then the other perspective is calling out Hinduphobia is immediately equated with Hindu nationalism and in Hindutva. So how do you answer that? And I know I just want to quickly plug in that there is a very good paper on this by Vishwa Adluri, Cry Hindutva, that may come very handy. And I will try to put the link here while you are answering.
Yeah. That is $1 million question, and not one that I've been able to find a good, satisfactory answer to. Because those who are disposed to wanting to disparage Hindus, they can't be convinced. But those who are open-minded, who are interested in more constructive engagement, hey, let's talk about a specific policy. And then we'll even ask the question, like, so where is the BJP on this particular issue? Or where is HAF on this particular issue? The folks who are willing to have those conversations, because look, HAF's stances are, some of them might align with things that the BJP is doing. Some of them may not. Some of the things that we have fought for maybe align with something that the Congress Party had passed, and some of it doesn't. Same thing with in the United States context as well. So I don't know that there's any single answer. The other issue is, we talked so much about a working definition of Hinduphobia. I don't know that there's a working definition of Hindutva. So it's this boogeyman in the room, and all we know is it's become like the equivalent of being called a racist. And maybe there are definitions of it that that might be the right framework for it. But I don't think that everyone who says, hey, I believe in Hindutva, may have that same sort of definition. So that remains a challenge. Something like a Hindu supremacist makes me chuckle every time I hear it. What are we going to do? Like, we're going to impose having to be pluralistic? Like, it's such a nonsensical term if you're looking at it theologically, as opposed to other traditions where supremacy means an imposition of a particular set of laws into the political framework, or sees the world as us and them, while in the Hindu ethos, and not to say that the ethos is always what we see in praxis, we're humans at the end of the day, but this notion that there's an underlying unity in all of us, that makes us the human race, and even beyond the human race, that makes us part of existence, and that includes animals and the planet and everything else. It's such a sloppy equation to kind of Euro-Abrahamic realities.
Before I go to Ram or Nishant again, I have another quick question from Rama Shankar. Could you please clarify the difference between heritage learner and Hindu student? I think it's.
Oh, okay, yeah, and you can go to the Hindu the Hinduphobia glossary to read it, because sometimes I know reading it might help. So heritage learner is actually it's a legitimate a term that's used in academia. So say I am a native Gujarati speaker, right? But then say my college offered Gujarati because I speak it, but now I want to learn how to read and write it, or I want to learn the grammar, or I want to take a Gujarati literature course or something like that. My being in that classroom would make me a heritage learner, meaning I have some sort of foundation in the language, but now am going to study it in a different means. So I think it provides a framework for educators to best address the needs of those types of students. In the Hindu context, some South Asian professors have kind of adopted this nomenclature to call Hindu students, or view Hindu students, as heritage students or heritage learners, meaning that they come with what these professors see as their Hindu baggage. They might have grown up going to Bal Vihar. They might have grown up in a very devout Hindu household. So they're going to have some strongly formed ideas of the tradition, of the philosophy, of the teachings. So these heritage learners are that subset, not the ones that might be coming in kind of like fresh white sheet of paper and don't really have that context, but the ones who us as parents made that effort to pass on the tradition. Those types of students are seen as like kind of a eye-rolling burden, like, oh great, now this is going to make my job that much harder because I'm going to have someone in class who's going to question the way that I'm teaching about Hinduism, right? So hopefully that makes sense.
I think to give a good example here, just how it does work out in American college classrooms, and maybe these days even in school, high school, where let's say a young woman coming with a hijab is seen as to be celebrated, spoken well. But imagine a Hindu student going with her kumkum, or God forbid, a boy student going with a tilak on his forehead. The kind of reception and the kind of basically saying, you know what, you are traditional Hindu and these are all things wrong with you.
Yeah.
I think that is, because this is something that I even mentioned to that Slate reporter. Mm-hmm. when he didn't bother, I said, look, if you are saying Hindu supremacy, are we a part of maybe 57 Hindu nations, the organization of the Hindu Council? Are we part of the European tradition where we are Christian nations with with kings and monarchies that are identify themselves as Christian. What are we talking about here? But then again, this as you said, this kind of topsy-turvy, Humpty Dumpty world that we have been made part of. And at one level, it is kind of, you can see the humor, but at another level, you see this sustained campaign and you see how demonic it is. And you wonder, really, what is it about the nature of reality that enables these kinds of presentations of the good as bad and as the problematic as celebratory?
Yeah, I'll just add that, when I was in college, I have a bachelor's in economics, but also religion. As a teenager, I kept asking my friends, why do we do this? Why do we do this? And they couldn't answer my questions there, because their answer was, because that's what we do. And that was not satisfactory for me. And so, I started with Chinmaya Mission, and all of a sudden, this philosophical tradition that I had seen in practice, but didn't have the words and the concepts for, opened up for me. And that kind of sparked a lifelong drive to want to learn. And so as I studied religion as an undergraduate, and we see a lot of this happening in these types of departments, I was fortunate. I had a professor when I was reading, everyone knows Wendy Doniger. Back then, I think she was Wendy O'Flaherty. And I was reading something, and I'm like, what the heck is this? Like, has no bearing on what I've seen. And of course, mine is, just one little experience in this vast universe. But it wasn't the experience of most of the people I knew. And my teacher said, you can't always believe what you read. And that was like mind blowing for me. But so every once in a while, you do come across, there are good guys, in the academy who open your eyes to being discerning and continuing to explore and dig deeper and deeper and deeper. So hopefully people will come back to that. Next question.
Okay, all right, let me go. Have you seen an increased attack on Hindus and Hinduism recently? And if so, what do you think are the reasons for such attacks? And who do you think are behind such attacks?
Good question. Very timely question. I think, Rameshji, what did I say? These days, it feels like we're trying to drink out of a fire hydrant in terms of the types of assaults on Hindu Americans specifically. Absolutely, it's gotten worse. The first wave of it getting worse was probably when the BJP came into power, and then when President Trump, under those 4 years, when a lot of the broader American rhetoric was getting more and more fever pitched and extreme. That too has lent to attacks on Hindu American institutions and individuals. In terms of who's behind it, I kind of covered that early on, right? When we're talking about vertical hostilities and horizontal hostilities and some of the motives. I still think there are underlying colonial assumptions, racist tropes of how we are being portrayed. The Cisco case in California and the California Department of Education. We've filed a third-party motion in that case, and we're not speaking, or we're not weighing in on the specific facts of the case. If this individual, John Doe, faced some sort of discrimination, of course he should get justice, and we firmly believe that existing law provides that avenue. But when you look at the way that the department framed its complaint to equate caste with the Hindu religion, to conflate caste with race, to conflate caste with color. All of these are rooted in are rooted in colonial constructs, in racism, in religious supremacy, or back from then when these narratives were first formed. And Vishwa Adluri, as you said, and Joydeep Bhakti both cover this in depth. The entire way in which even today those narratives and Indology frameworks shape and inform how we are being seen and portrayed now through policy that is going to, it's trying to speak on behalf of or trying to define a micro minority. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. We are 1% of the population. So, that's one example. And then, of course, because we are trying to provide an avenue, maybe you could call it a middle path, to say, look, any injustice that occurs, let's fix it. And that's going to happen through education, where employers and employees are educated about what their rights and responsibilities are in terms of how we treat other people. That let's not have, state agencies perpetuate racist racist theories and tropes about Hindus. And let's look at how other communities of color, whether it's indigenous Native Americans, or whether it's Latinas, or whether it's Africans and African Americans, the space that we're giving these communities to point out the impact of colonialism, to point out the impact of racism and all these other things on how they're viewed. We give them space to do that. How about we do the same for Hindus as well? And it's not happening. And it's the same set of, like, it's just that South Asian mindset that has inserted itself into the illiberal left in doing that. And I say that with deep disappointment as a liberal myself, as a lifelong Democrat. It's deeply disturbing, and it needs to be called out.
So next question I have is from Vijay Raghavan from Mumbai. And you may have already touched on it a little bit, because it goes about Trump and now the liberal government, so-called, in the US. But I would like you to take this question on role of USCIRF that they has on the internal politics, or even in external, in India.
Yes, you, sir. That is Rameshji and my favorite place to go. Fun fact, it was years before USCIRF ever felt it was important to hear from Hindu voices. And so in the first time in its history, when it invited Hindus to provide testimony, Rameshji and I testified before several of the commissioners. And so, I'd say we at HAF have a love-hate relationship with the US Commission. And so again, and I think that speaks to our general approach. Even if we disagree on a lot, if we can find a place where it would make sense to work together because it's going to provide some sort of relief to, or it's going to alleviate suffering for a group of people, we will work together. So while USCIRF has, and I would invite people to read some of the stuff that I've written on this, on the history of USCIRF. I don't want to take too much time here about that, but essentially it was intended initially to be a government agency that would monitor Christian persecution around the world. But the United States is, in theory and technically, a secular democracy. So I think that, after several rounds of the piece of legislation that would have established USCIRF not getting passed, enough people realize that, wait a minute, we have a little bit of a problem here. If we're going to monitor religious freedom, it has to be for everyone, not just Christians. I don't think USERF has ever really gotten away, though, from that kind of foundational catalyst. So, we will work with USERF and provide them our human rights reports where we're documenting human rights atrocities against Hindu minorities in Pakistan, in Kashmir, in Bangladesh, Malaysia. And they have, unfortunately, they're not driven by really a commitment to religious freedom, but they are driven by the political agendas of their individual commissioners with this underlying or that foundational catalyst that they can't really escape. And that leads to a disparity in terms of how human rights atrocities are monitored and called out. So, where we can at least give voice to the bodies in the American government that are looking at religious freedom, we have. And when it's time to call them out, we do. So I'll give one quick example. A couple of years ago, they hired basically a Pakistani political operative to author a special report on India. Um, that sort of lack of discernment when you are even if you're a quasi government body, is so irresponsible. It makes America look bad. And I, as an American, don't like that. That's, as an American, I want to support a government that actually, this is idealistic, but that actually stands by the values that are outlined in the Constitution and that are highlighted in our political nomenclature, whatever the case may be. And so those are the types of major missteps where the politics that drives their priorities become very clear.
I
Ram,
think we can take one more question, Avatansi.
Ram, you have a question? Or you want me
Yeah,
to
we'll
go?
ask one last question. Let me use my judgment to pick from this list. Suhag, what has been your experience working with academics and scholars and getting their support to advocate for Hindus and to speak for Hinduism?
It's been a positive one, but it's been one that has not come without a cost to them. So, we have worked with, I'd say, maybe 2 dozen. It's not many over the years. First of all, let me just say that, when we're looking at the humanities or social sciences or things like that, it's not like we make up a huge percentage of that, right? Like if it was engineering or business or medicine, it's going to be a different situation. So I want to keep that in context. But we've had a number of academics who have worked with us as academic experts because we have this robust Hinduism 101 program in which we are improving the way in which Hinduism is taught in K through 12. And that's what gives our work credibility, is because we do work with academic scholars. When it came to textbook reform in California, there were a number of academics who came forward to let the state of California know that, hey, listen, these changes that the community is advocating for are not these politically motivated, Hindu supremacist narratives that they're trying to insert into textbooks, but these are legitimate errors that are imbibed into the way that Hinduism is taught. So the problem is for them is many of them have been attacked by their colleagues. They too have been labeled as Hindutva. I actually participated on a panel at the American Academy of Religions where we had an entire session on this. So I have 2 articles that you can find on HAF's blog on the weaponization of Hindutva, and it covers some of the things that I brought up earlier about politicians and donors, but also academics. So yes, we have gotten academic support, and sadly and unfortunately, it's come at a cost. So I would imagine, again, going back to this idea of silent majority, I think there are a lot more scholars out there who understand the unfairness of the defamatory attacks that are occurring on HAF or the unfair attacks on Hindus more generally, but don't feel or know, are not in a position to be able to take on the risk, the professional risk that might come with it.
Yeah, I think, this is a challenge that we all have to kind of work through, because when we say we are Hindu, or when you say you are the Hindu American Foundation, you are accused of being turncoats and called, you are basically supporters of Hindutva. But then you say, oh no, actually we are Hindu, then we are accused of being Manuwadis, Savarnas, or whatever. So damned if you do, damned if you don't, heads you lose, or whatever, huh? Which simply means that, and again, this is not merely hypothesizing or theorizing about this. We have faced that. And we have literally, HAF has been called out publicly in an academic scholarly article by a former supporter of HAF to be turncoats, that you are Hindutva, you are not Hindu.
Yeah.
But when you say you are Hindu, then you are called Manuwadis. It's a strange,
Yeah.
Where can you be? What is the space that is given to us Hindus? And I think this is something that we need to continue to kind of navigate, to use an ambiguous word.
I'll just add real quick to end on a positive note. Because that's what I like to do.
Yeah.
Is that I think, as crappy as it is to be on the receiving end of this, we need to really look at it as an opportunity. There are other communities and other civilizations, Jewish, African, Latin, Native American, who have all faced this, but they don't have this additional burden that we have, or at least to the best of my knowledge. But this is where we need to build allyship with other, previously colonized peoples or institutions that have been built by those people, in order to share best practices and to support one another. And I think that's a great opportunity for us.
Thank you so very much, Suhag. It has been a pleasure listening to you. Privileged to have you with us today. I believe all those who attended today's session would walk away with a lot of information, useful information, and the kind of work that you're doing. And this is something that I want to, make a pitch for HAF, because you do so much good work, that call to action, messages that come into your mailboxes. Please respond. If we don't, if we are not politically engaged, we can't simply blame others for running away with the ball. And I think HAF is doing so much good work. You have such good people with you. We wish you all the best. And let's come back again. And because we need more of these informational sessions. We are not propagandists. We want to inform. We are the original objective people. As Roberto Calasso mentions in his book, Order, it is only in the Rig Veda that there's a 146 mention of the mind. Okay, in no other religious text would you, in other religious texts, okay, would you even find a mention, even one mention of the mind? So we are mindful people.
Right. That's it.
So, and let's continue to be that. And then I tell my son, my good son Sudan, look, in the Ramayana, we have all these episodes where the Rakshasas keep coming and disturbing the yagas and yagnas over and over again. It doesn't stop. But then the good work, the yagnas keep on going. That should be our attitude in life. And I hope with that, that hopefully will energize us and to kind of keep us on the good path. Okay. And so once again, thank you so much. And I want to thank all my panelists today, Avatans, Nishant, Ramsundar, Arjun, and of course, our India supporters, starting with Hari Kiran, Srinivas ji, Ram Prasad ji, and Anuj. So these are the people who have made today's session possible. And so once again, namaskars and thank you.
Thank you.